Welcome to the City Club of Portland, Oregon's most respected public forum. The City Club was founded in 1915 as a civic research organization. Today, its members are 2,000 men and women who share a common interest in the quality of life and government in the Portland metropolitan community. The City Club meets on Fridays at noon in downtown Portland to present speakers selected for their distinction in specialized fields, their knowledge of specific issues, and the freshness and vitality of their ideas. This week's speakers are Senator Fred Hurd, President of the Oregon State Senate, and Representative Hardy Myers, Speaker for the Oregon House of Representatives. Their topic, the outlook for the 1981 legislature. And now, the club's presiding officer will introduce today's speaker.
For today's program, on Monday, January 12, 1981, the 61st regular session of the Oregon legislature convened. As anticipated, the immediate discussions concerned the budget, taxes, reapportionment, budget, the energy, budget, education, budget, and the so-called, quote, reality of limits that also relates to budget. Our two speakers today have come directly from Salem on an extended session, so there's no better way to talk about issues of taxes and the budget than on an empty stomach. Our topic is the outlook for the 1981 Oregon legislature, and our speakers, the President of the Oregon Senate, Fred Hurd, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Hardy Myers. Each will speak approximately 10 minutes, and we hope to have an extended period for some questions and answers. Our first speaker will be Senator Fred Hurd. Senator Hurd is a Democrat representing Senate District number 27, which includes Deschutes County and most of Klamath County. He is a native of Prineville, an educator by profession with degrees from Southern Oregon College, and he currently serves as the Assistant Director of Continuing Education at Oregon Institute of Technology. He was elected to the Oregon House of Representatives in 1968 and re-elected in 1970. In 1973, he was elected to the Oregon Senate, re-elected in 76, and again in 1980, his third term. He has just been elected to his first term as the President of the Oregon Senate and has previously served as the Senate Majority Leader since 1975. It's my pleasure to introduce the Senator Fred Hurd, the President of the Oregon Senate.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you. I always enjoy the Portland City Club, certainly one of the most respected forums in the state of Oregon. Mr. Speaker, although it's still very early in the 1981 legislative session, some trends and projections are already apparent, and you heard some of them today. Almost everything is laced with the budget. The Speaker and I have agreed that he's going to give his budget sermon today, and so I'll limit my remarks in that particular area, but I want to indicate to you that as President of the Senate, I consider the budget of profound importance this session. I am pleased that the organization of the Senate was achieved quickly and with relatively few problems. My committees have already begun working on a number of bills, and the makeup of those committees is indicative of one of my top priorities for this session, a truly statewide Senate. As I said in my opening speech as President of the Senate, tough fiscal decisions facing us this session make it incumbent that every area of the state be represented on all committees, particularly the Ways and Means Committee. And we have achieved the regional and philosophical balance on these committees that I've discussed for 2 years now. And a bill to expand the Ways and Means Committee has passed both houses, today the House of Representatives, and the governor is expected to sign that bill today. This will allow the addition of another senator, and I intend to appoint Senator Tony Meeker, a Republican from Amity, to another term on the Ways and Means Committee. As you know, Oregon faces a potential deficit of some $450 million, and this would be the case if all current problems are continued at existing levels and if there were no increases in revenue. Obviously, that is not a realistic expectation. The task of reviewing every agency's budget is a long and arduous one, and one which traditionally involves subcommittees of the Ways and Means Committee. And by expanding that committee by 2, we will have a better opportunity for in-depth review of budgets by more legislators whose subcommittee recommendations are presented to the full committee for approval before they are sent to the floors of both houses for passage. It isn't always so, but in the majority of cases, recommendations of the subcommittees which have had the opportunity to review lengthy testimony on their areas of assignment generally are accepted by the full committee. Thus, the benefit of more heads involved in the original decision-making and the benefit of 6-member committees as opposed to 4 in the areas of human resources and education. As part of my effort for a statewide Senate, I have made it clear to my colleagues that each of them must understand and appreciate the needs and concerns of other areas. Tunnel vision is not acceptable in an age where the state as a whole must be considered, because what affects Eastern Oregon has an impact on the Portland area. The problems of coastal fishermen indirectly will reflect on apple growers in Hood River. Transportation issues are as real to urban area residents as they are to those in the heavily populated areas. Economic development and diversification is a statewide need, not confined to Burns or Bly or other areas heavily dependent on the timber industry. These areas have suffered high unemployment as a result of nationwide problems affecting that industry. I feel confident that the committees of the Senate will deal fairly and responsibly with all of these issues from a standpoint of the best and highest good for all Oregonians, not from a strictly partisan or a strictly parochial or a strictly buddy point of view. With money unusually tight, the legislature will have to consider proposals to increase taxes to ease the state's budget difficulties. One controversial question will be the level at which the state property tax relief program will be continued. The governor has proposed continuing the program at the 30% level, which would require $538.8 million from the state general fund, a 15% increase over the 1979-81 allocation for property tax relief. And I think it's important for us to note that as we talk about the increased needs of Oregonians in the areas of human resources, in the areas of education, in the areas of almost anything that we might be concerned with, and then as we talk about the need for additional revenues, we can't talk about maintaining the current level of services without discussion of, in some way, of additional revenue. And so we're asking our members to keep all doors open. Another key issue for the 1981 legislature will be reapportionment, redrawing legislative district boundary lines. The issue will be doubly interesting this year, since the legislature will have the task of drawing a new 5th congressional district as well as redrawing legislative districts. The state constitution directs the legislature to reapportion its districts every 10 years in the legislative session that immediately follows completion of the federal census. If the legislature cannot complete a legislative reapportionment plan, or if a plan it does draw is rejected by the governor or the courts, the duty of redrawing the districts falls on the Secretary of State. I have every expectation that if we get our figures on time, with the people the Speaker has appointed to his committee and the people that I've appointed in the Senate, that we can really make a serious effort at reapportioning legislative districts this year. Faced with a growing concern about the future fulfillment of Oregon's energy needs, the legislature will spend a considerable amount of time deciding the role the state should take in leading its citizens to a more secure energy future. The governor has proposed a $144 million state energy program aimed primarily at promoting development of such alternative energy resources as solar, wind, and geothermal. My appointment in the Senate of a separate committee on energy, the first substantive committee dealing only with this topic, will, I feel sure, develop a realistic energy program to take Oregon into the 21st century and serve as a model for other states. The legislature is faced with several proposals for revamping the state's controversial and complex workers' compensation system. At the center of debate will be the detailed report compiled by the governor's task force on workers' compensation. The task force is urging that the job of rehabilitating injured workers be shifted from the state to private industry. Oregon employers pay more than $500 million a year for mandatory workers' compensation coverage, and Oregon has the highest workers' compensation insurance rates in the nation, in addition to being rated one of the most generous in terms of workers' compensation benefit plans in the country. Since voters in November rejected a legislative request for authority to issue $85 million in state bonds to finance new correctional facilities, the 1981 legislature is going to grapple with the problems of easing crowded conditions in Oregon state prisons. There is a probability also that legislation will be introduced in this session which would reinstate the death penalty in Oregon via statute. As you are aware, last week, the Oregon Supreme Court overturned the state's death penalty approved by voters in 1978 following an initiative referendum. The court held language in the referendum did not mesh with language in the statutes. Although the state was still a couple of years away from implementing the death penalty before the Supreme Court's ruling was announced, no money for constructing a death chamber was included in the governor's budget. Estimates put cost of constructing a death chamber at between $300,000 and $500,000. At my request, Senator Meeker will introduce in this session a bill which would require parolees to pay $10 a month for costs of supervision by parole officers. This program will generate about $3.6 million in new revenue. Construction of new cells at the prison, estimated at about $1.9 million, also has been proposed in the governor's budget. It is my opinion that this proposal can be deferred to the 1983 session. With the charge to parolees and deferral of prison block construction, that would allow us to recapture about $5.5 million for other uses. The legislature will be asked to determine the future functions of the State Land Conservation and Development Commission. Created in 1973, the commission is in charge of overseeing the development of comprehensive land use plans for all of Oregon. All of those plans are due to be completed this year, and the commission is in the process of completing its review. The current legislature will be considering the commission's future role after the comprehensive plans are completed, including whether it will have authority to review amendments in those plans. There are many, many other issues that will come, some sleepers that we probably never heard of before. But I think that as we get into this session, you're going to find that the members are up to the challenge of possibly the most difficult session in our lifetime. We're looking forward to working together in Salem to resolve many of the problems that we face as Oregonians as we enter this new decade. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Hardy Myers. Hardy Myers is a Democrat representing District Number 9, which includes portions of southeast and northeast Portland. A native of Mississippi, he received a law degree from the University of Oregon and has been associated with a Portland law firm for the past 15 years. He is currently serving his fourth successive term in the House of Representatives and his second term as the 56th Speaker of the House. It's my pleasure to introduce to you the Speaker of the House, Hardy Myers.
Members of the City Club, guests, President Hurd, it's a pleasure to be here today with President Hurd to try to give you a little bit of a preview of this 61st Assembly and at a stage before the careful, detailed consideration of what is going to be a very large agenda of problems has really gotten underway. The central responsibility of the Assembly is, of course, budget making, and I think it very accurate to say that so far as the budget making responsibility is concerned, this is the regular session, at least in modern times, in which the worm has turned, and with a vengeance. We've enjoyed over the past decade, at least, a steady and at times rather dramatic growth in the state's general fund. And it has made possible, that growth has made possible over the past decade, at least moderately sufficient amounts of commitment by the state to its own programs, but at the same time, an enormous increase in the transfer functions of state government, the use of the general fund for basic school support, and property tax relief, whether funneled to local governments directly or to individuals to assist in bearing the burden of the property tax as the primary mechanism for the finance of local government, particularly schools. We began the session 2 years ago with a projected surplus, general fund surplus of roughly $250 million. We are now beginning a regular session with the governor's assessment, as expressed in his total budget, that the minimum spending needs of the state of Oregon during the next biennium will be about $245 million more than the revenues we are expecting to receive. Now that is a political and policy challenge or situation that I don't think any legislature has faced in modern times. Members and the public may have at the beginning of a session perceived that needs were more or less in line with revenue, but I don't think any governor in modern times has said that needs, minimum needs, are that far in excess of anticipated revenue from present sources. Now what that is going to do, and I think I can preview it in pretty accurate detail right now for you, what that's going to do is, as the session moves along, gradually bring members to a point, to a moment of truth, I'll call it, at which the Ways and Means Committee's assessment of minimum needs will be ready for the members' consideration. Not in the sense of having been reported out of committee, but in the sense of having reached a consensus within the Ways and Means Committee. Those total needs, that total needs assessment may be more, doubtfully little more, but it may be somewhat less than the governor's assessment as reflected in his budget, but I suspect it will be somewhere around the same total dollar amount, so far as the state's basic programs are concerned and basic school support. And unless the revenue projections change, that means we're going to be looking later in this session at an assessment of needs that may be as much as $250 million more than expected revenue. And members are going to have to come face to face with the choice of either revenue increases to finance those needs, to meet those needs as assessed by the Ways and Means Committee, or to decrease the property tax relief plan by the amount of the deficit, $250 million, it may well be more than that, or a combination of those, or to send the Ways and Means Committee back into the budgets and pull out the $250 million. And that's going to come out of higher education and human resources primarily, as you would all know, and potentially, of course, out of basic school support. Those three areas really for practical purposes, have all the money. Now that is a political and policy decision of a kind that, as I said earlier, I don't think any members in the Assembly have faced, or the Assembly has faced in recent times. If you state the choices in that fashion, just on their surface, or if you were to say to people, poll them and say, should we cut government spending in order to meet anticipated revenue, I suppose 99.9% of the people would say, of course, you cut to meet your expected revenue, as an individual would. But the thing that is going to give the Assembly pause in that scenario, in just walking quickly to adopt that approach, is that we're not talking about minor cuts here. We're talking about cuts in the order of, as I say, $250 million to perhaps $300 million, concentrated in areas of the budget which have already taken massive cuts in the special session. $130 million was cut then from higher education and human resources. I cannot tell you at this moment how that decision will be made, what the decision will be. But the most important starting point, and I want to conclude my comments on the budget with this note, the most important element in that, the point of departure for reaching that decision, is a needs assessment of the Ways and Means Committee, which members in both parties and in both the House and the Senate can review and feel is credible. It's at that point that members will then have to come to grips with the questions of the other choices I mentioned as far as closing any projected gap. Suggestions have been freely made that the property tax relief plan itself be the source of closing most of that deficit. And the $250 million reduction in that program would cut it by approximately 50%. On its face, it's possible, of course, to argue that every state program ought to bear some share of the burden of meeting a projected deficit. But we're working under a couple of major political constraints in dealing with the tax relief plan, of course. We're working with a vote last May on the plan. We're working with the vote on Measure 6, which was backdropped by the plan, and which the plan, I think, had some role in the vote against Measure 6 last fall. And frankly, we are working with a concern that a significant reduction in the property tax relief plan will revive and perhaps now make successful efforts at a much more destructive approach to local government finance in the state. And believe me, we cannot survive a Measure 6 in Oregon, not of the form that we had before us last fall, not in a form that extracts $1.5 billion of levying authority from our local governments, and particularly at a time when the general fund itself is in the condition that it's in. President Hurd has mentioned a number of the other areas of priority attention this session, and I won't go over those again. We'll leave opportunity for questions in a number of those areas. I certainly agree with him that those he has mentioned are among the most important. I'll conclude by saying that as far as the nature of the work of this session is concerned, in whatever the area, given the revenue situation, it is, as I've been saying more than once in public forums, it is, of course, a hold-the-line session. It is a session in which members are charged with the responsibility of trying to minimize damage to the elements of life in Oregon which are assisted by government and which represent such massive investments by our people through their tax dollars through the years. Our systems of education, both elementary and secondary and higher education, our transportation system, and so on. All these basic, very fundamental elements of life. We're not talking about exotic budget questions for wasteful programs, weapons systems, questions of that kind. These are all pretty basic issues as to the nature of life in Oregon. Certainly, I'm going to be making every effort, as I know President Hurd will, and as I think all members will, to work our way through that particular kind of responsibility with as little damage as possible to the elements of life in Oregon and to the investment that we've all made through the years in trying to make Oregon the kind of place we know it is and want to keep it. Thank you.
We're now at the point of questions and answers from the audience. The privilege of questions is for City Club members. We do have a microphone at the center, and I will identify the speakers, and you can address either speaker. Bill.
My name is William Scott. I'm a member of the City Club. Question for Mr. Myers. First, we in local government would like to welcome the state legislature to the moment of truth. Unfortunately, we can't gloat because your problem is our problem. To put in perspective the $250 million deficit, as I calculated, that's about 8% of the expected revenues of the state of Oregon. We in the Portland Public Schools expect it to cost $173 million next year to run the programs that we're running right now. Counting our voter-approved tax base and Governor Atia's proposed state budget, we will have revenues of about $140 million. That's a shortfall of $33 million, or about 25% of our revenues for next year. Under the governor's proposal, the state will fund only about 25% of Portland's school costs in the basic school support. We will reduce from 30% to 25% the reimbursement for our increased costs of state mandated services to the handicapped. And then, yes, this is the question is right. Those 2 points and one third one, which is that under the legislature's A-B ballot system, the A ballot, which is supposed to conceptually fund maintenance of effort, we are allowed to do a $4 million A ballot in 1981-82. My question is, what hope can you see for Portland in relieving us in any of those three areas?
I could offer you even a glimmer of hope. My problem is at this point, Bill, I can't honestly tell you there is or isn't hope, even insignificant hope. In fact, the prospect may be for deterioration in terms of the state's position in relation to the school district here, because depending on the level of basic school support, that's going to trigger, of course, re-examination of the formula. And that re-examination will undoubtedly involve adjustments that will impact on the basic grant districts, those that don't receive equalization, as part of a total cutback in percentage of support. I wish I could tell you more right now in response to your question, but that's where we are. I might add, too, that the question of the A-B ballot, to the extent that that structure has been, the working of that structure has been impacted or would be impacted by, for example, the reduction in the level of basic school support, that's all going to be considered together as a package. All of that in conjunction with the work of the Revenue Committee on the one side and the Ways and Means Committee in determining the appropriation for basic.
Did you want to respond to that?
Well, just one small short comment. I think it's important when we talk about education finance to keep in mind that this is not a legislature that's anti-education. I think that's very important. I used the statement at the special session in August that as we have to cut and as we have to deal with these particular questions, where we have to, we'll use a scalpel as opposed to a butcher knife or a hatchet or something along that line. We're going to do our best, and that's all we can say at this point.
In the last session 2 years ago, my recollection is that some 3,000 bills were introduced for consideration. Many of these were frivolous. Undoubtedly, many were necessary, and certainly some were simple ego trips on the part of the legislature. What is being done to prevent the travesty of that last couple of weeks when bills were railroaded through without real consideration that they deserve?
Both houses have rules about the numbers of bills that can come to the floor in any particular day. Let me indicate to you that in terms of total bills introduced last session, that number was under the previous session. And I'm advised by Legislative Council that so far this session, we're under last session. But also keep in mind that during this session of the legislature, in any session of the legislature, what might be frivolous in my mind might address a very important need to some interest in some district that a representative or senator represents, and they should be able to bring that to the attention of the Assembly. So while we are working on the question as far as introduction of bills, and I think the members are watching this themselves, let's keep in mind that this is the only forum that we have in the state of Oregon to bring these issues for discussion and so on, and also some frivolous actions of the past have become very important policies in the future and good sound policies.
Yeah. As President Hurd has said, the total number of bills that will be introduced, I'm sure will be, or at least present indications make pretty clear, will be below, and maybe even well below last session. I, for one, have always opposed the concept of trying to limit the introduction of bills in the sense of trying to define some number of bills a particular member could introduce. Because I think, as I may have said once here at the City Club, a member's introduction of a bill is his or her most important form of speech. It is the form of speech unique to the membership in the Assembly. And I think the idea of trying to impose an arbitrary limit on the number of times that can be exercised for the member or on behalf of someone outside the Assembly is just plain wrong. And I saw the Washington legislature, I guess, did that in the House. I feel that's a terrible kind of step to take. The question of the closing day crush, which I'll comment on very briefly, is something I don't believe we'll ever totally be able to eliminate. It's a work management question we'll try to do our best to control. What I want to try to achieve, in cooperation with President Hurd, is to avoid the situation where really major legislation is coming out of one body over to the other very, very late in the session. So it's not just a matter of the crush of bills in terms of members considering them on the floor, but you have a situation where really the bicameral nature of the legislature is being erased. And that happens all too often. Now, we're in the House going to try, and I hope we'll be able to establish a working relationship with the Senate, try to establish timetables for action on the major agenda items that we have, and at least avoid the situation where one house really doesn't have the time to give careful study to significant proposals from the other body.
Ray?
I'm Ray Kalani, a member of the City Club. I guess I want to express our appreciation for being reminded by Mr. Myers and Senator Hurd of the very tough times that we're facing, of the fact that we really have to make some hard choices. I forget which one of you gentlemen mentioned $144 million being considered by the governor for an energy program. I would almost be sure that in that proposal, there is no money for a very important energy consideration. Both in the nation and in Oregon, one of the main energy problems is our over-reliance on automobile transportation. Almost 80% of the total petroleum consumption in the state of Oregon is for transportation. And 50% of the total energy consumption per household in Oregon is represented by transportation. So the question is this: with the prospect of reduced federal support for public transit, what will the state do in this session to beef up financially the obvious alternative, which is public transit both in cities and in between cities?
Let me say that I will continue my strong support for one thing, the Willamette rail train service. There are bills that are being considered. I signed one to the Energy Committee this morning, which will establish a tax credit system for people who use public transit. I think it's very important. It's during my legislative lifetime, the 12 years that I've been in the legislature, where mass transit is finally recognized by the state of Oregon. I think it's terribly important. It's an issue that we'll discuss within the confines of our budget limitations, but also keeping in mind what I said about our energy goals. And I can assure you that Senator Halleck, who is the chairman of the Energy Committee and was named to that position by me for the simple reason he has one of the most fertile, imaginative minds I think we have in the legislature. Those of you that know Ted, he's going to like that if he hears that. But I'm convinced in discussions that we've had, and I've asked him to make sure that mass transit is equally considered in terms of his energy program. So that's about the best answer I can give you right now.
I think given the budget constraints of this particular session, probably the most you will be seeing as far as immediately benefiting action would be adoption of the governor's recommended general fund commitments to the assistance in the operation of mass transit districts, or the finances of mass transit districts. But I think also that there is a high level of interest in the Assembly among particularly legislators from urban areas, but not just urban areas, to couple our work in connection with the question of the gas tax fund and the maintenance of the highway system, couple that with work in a larger picture in trying to strive towards some continuing structure for the assistance of the costs of mass transit districts in the state as an alternative to this effort to just scratch around and carve out some little amount every session in terms of those particular costs. I don't know what that structure might look like, but I can tell you there are members in positions of importance on that issue in the Assembly who have no interest in spending a lot of time in connection with the highway maintenance issue unless the issue of mass transit finance is linked in with it and approached as a package. And that effort is going to be made.
Thank you.
Next question.
Member, Bill Scott mentioned state-mandated programs in the school. My question relates to the state-mandated court system in the counties. Will there be money this year for state takeover of the court system?
The prospects are not very promising. That, incidentally, is my own, I suppose, number one legislative interest is the finance and the administration of the justice system. And there isn't anything I'd like to see more than to get onto a system in which we treat the court system as a state system, borne costs primarily by the general fund, and with a unitary budgeting process in which the judiciary is responsible at all levels for presenting a single overall judiciary budget to the legislature. The problem as far as the finances is straightforwardly in the numbers. Even if we confine the takeover in this biennium to the last quarter of the biennium, I think the best estimates we now have is that would add about $15 million of general fund expense, and I believe that's net after taking into account the transfer of revenues from that system into the general fund and away from local government. And in the next biennium, the full biennium, that cost would escalate to between $50 and $65 million. So that's the predicament the numbers present against the backdrop of the total budget situation.
Next question.
My name is Malcolm Dower. I'm a member of the City Club. My question is for President Fred Hurd. You made certain statements about how this was going to be a nonpartisan approach to the budget and other things in the legislature. And you say that you promised Senator Meeker a place on the Ways and Means Committee, which would be the only Senate Republican on that committee. In the state with a Republican governor, 2 Republican senators, and who voted for Ronald Reagan last time, it's going to be a big job for Senator Meeker, with all due respect, Senator Meeker.
He's up to it. He what?
You weren't able to put him up to it yet. You just promised that he will be the...
Oh, no, I am today announcing my appointment for Senator Meeker. And of course, he's been meeting with the Ways and Means Committee since the first week of the session. And
do you have any comment upon your original choice of a full Senate phalanx on the Ways and Means Committee?
A full what?
A full Democratic phalanx on the Ways and Means.
Sure.
Of course, you had to be elected president, I know that.
Oh, yes, I do. I'm glad you brought the question up. As a matter of fact, I indicated more than 2 years ago that I felt that the next Senate should be one that was statewide in nature, that we could no longer elect presidents, select chairmen, or whatever, on the basis of where they happen to be living. As I came to the Senate presidency and I looked at the Ways and Means Committee, the City of Portland had no representation on the Ways and Means Committee. I felt that for the size of the metropolitan area and so on, they certainly 2 seats was fair. As I looked at the rest of the state, I didn't feel that the coast should be left off. I didn't feel that Southern Oregon should be left off. I didn't feel that Eugene should be without representation, or the capital in Salem, or Eastern Oregon. The Ways and Means Committee is a statutory committee. As I constructed the rest of the committees in the Senate, the authority for the Education Committee, the Agriculture Committee, and all of the others except Trade and Economic Development, Ways and Means, and a few in-house committees, those committees are, if the President of the Senate decides they're going to be 5 members, they're 5 members. If they're 7 members, they're 7 members. So I could look, for instance, at the Education Committee, constructed in a statewide fashion. If I needed minority representation, I had the choice of adding some seats, which on occasion I did. As I constructed a statewide Ways and Means Committee and got proper representation from throughout Oregon, I simply didn't have any more seats. That was my first pledge as a candidate for President of the Senate. So the alternative then, because I did want minority representation, Senator Meeker has served several distinguished sessions on the Ways and Means Committee, was to go for an expansion. The Ways and Means Committee during my 12 years has been expanded on other occasions. The Emergency Board started out, I think, with 3 members back a number of years ago, and it's now up to a rather large number. It's been expanded over the years. It is not a sacred number, but I felt very strongly about minority representation, and accordingly, when I discussed this with Senator Meeker, I asked him to attend the meetings. Senator Fadley, the chairman of the Senate Ways and Means Committee, also extended an invitation. Senator Meeker has attended those meetings, has taken the trips that the Ways and Means Committee has taken in the last week, is fully prepared to assume a spot on the Ways and Means Committee. Now, in terms of more representation, there are only 8 Republicans in the Senate. There are 22 Democrats. I feel that we have the minority representation. Senator Meeker understands the system in the Ways and Means Committee and is certainly able to handle the responsibilities. And that was my reasoning.
Next question. Don.
I'm Van Goley, City Club member. Question to both our speakers today. Oregon is facing the worst snowpack situation in areas outside the Columbia Basin and the coast that we've ever seen. This could have an enormous impact on the agricultural production of the state and the gross product of the state and the revenues to the state government. In addition, the lumber plywood industry, which is the single biggest employer in the state, may well be sliding back into recession because of the stratospheric interest rates impacting housing. My question is, to what extent is this being taken into account on the potential revenue side of the budget? To what extent, if we do have a devastating drought, and the most optimistic estimate is that if we have normal or better than normal snowfall between now and the end of the winter, we might have as much as a 50% snowpack, which is pretty bad. To what extent is the state prepared to do what it did in the 76-77 drought and provide some assistance to the farmers and ranchers? I should say to you that I asked that question of Governor Atiyeh on the news conference program a couple Saturdays ago, and he said that it would have quite an impact, but it had not yet been taken into account in his budget.
That was my impression also, that it factors like the impact of drought from this winter snowpack are not yet in that projection. But I have not yet seen the detail on the assumptions accompanying the last revenue forecast. And the Revenue Committee in the House, and I would imagine the Senate, is going to be spending some time shortly examining in detail the underlying premises of the present forecast, which is going to be the forecast before us until we get to May, roughly, after the filing of the income tax returns and the opportunity to process and compute the total returns from that filing. It's very likely, it seems to me, with the overall situation deteriorating in some respects, as you've pointed out, Dan, that the projections may wind up going down further. And that's why I was talking earlier in terms of the ultimate deficit about the possibility that it could be well in excess of $245 million. The question of what relief might be provided, it's impossible to say right now. To my knowledge, it is not a budgeted item. It would be something that would have to be worked into the budget from instead of other commitments, at least so far as the governor's pending budget is concerned.
Dan, that's one of the items that I had in mind when I said that there could be some sleepers that we haven't even dreamed of at the present time that could suddenly come to the front and become, paramount issues of the session. I think it's something we always have to be aware of. Having gone through that last drought as a member of the emergency board, I would hope that we wouldn't get into any cloud seeding schemes. But aside from that, I can assure you that we'll be following it closely.
Will your committees have any independent source of economic forecasting of events? Is that right?
About a 30-second answer.
You want to take that one
first?
I think we both will give you the same answer. Maybe not.
Well, no. We'll be dealing with all of the players and so on, their recommendations, following what their recommendations might be, and also our judgment, and that's pretty much where it is right now.
Can I add one thing?
Sure. Yeah.
I think in that regard it is important to point out that in the special session, in the process of dealing with the deficit we were facing then, we did pass a bill which amended the present statutes dealing with revenue forecasting to require that the forecasts as issued by the executive department be accompanied by a statement of the assumptions built into the forecast, so that we at least have the ability to see and to dialogue with the executive about that, and also to have others in our own professional support structure and outside the legislature review and comment on that. But I think we want to try to stay away from getting into competing forecasting functions. For one thing, we don't have the resources to have too much duplication of that kind of effort, and instead try to strive toward a maximum of shared information. Up to this point, or until that bill last session, it's been kind of a shell game. You can't find out very much information about what the assumptions represent or the projections represent. And it's a constant struggle just to pull that information out.
Our time has run out. I thank you for your participation. Our thanks to President Hurd and to Speaker Myers. Thank you very much for attending.
City Club's next speaker is Dr. Leon Kieserling, economist, who will discuss economic performance and policy. Where do we go from here? City Club meetings are videotaped on Fridays by Liberty Cable Television, Incorporated, and can be seen regularly on the following Monday at 2 p.m. and again at 7 p.m. over this cable channel. This program is intended for the private use of our viewing audience and may not be used otherwise without the expressed and written permission of the City Club of Portland.